and in our community organizations for people to recognize and fight for the sanctity of Black lives in this community and throughout our world. And we are also in a time of a bit of reckoning, specifically with issues of social justice and areas of identity, where families who have previously not had these conversations are being required to have these conversations. And to be in that moment also while quarantined together can be quite a tenuous time. So I would like to hold space for those folks. And in the chat or the question and answer section, I asked that if there are specific communities or people that you are gearing your activism or your energy toward, if there are names that you would like to lift up because they have been lost or impacted by COVID-19, or if there are names of those whose bodies have been stolen by systems of oppression within this country and throughout the globe, I welcome you to add their names into the question and answer now as we begin a brief moment of silence. I do thank you for that moment. So I mentioned that we would be talking about the purpose of these workshops. And as we began to move into July after a very active May and June, there came time when town halls were no longer enough, when people were not satisfied with just coming and acknowledging that there's pain in the world or that there was work that needed to be done around race and other areas of social justice. And it was my hope as the director of diversity education that we could provide platforms for folks to come and get the tools to begin the work. So we are in an active state of building, rebuilding, reframing our ideologies, our epistemology, and the way that we view ourselves within not only this institution, our individual campuses, or this country. So I wanted to take a moment to actually find place and do that work here. So that is the purpose behind the Beginning the workshop series and the work that we are doing with diversity education. We're also framing this work within an understanding of intersectionality. If you were with us last week, you know that we used a different graphic last week, and it was brought to our attention that that graphic did not include some areas of identity development and identity formation that truly needed to be there. And because we are also responsible to do the work that we're asking other people to do, we actually went back to the drawing board. I don't know why I'm speaking of myself in plural. I went back to the drawing board and used my good Canva skills to create a new intersectionality graphic that includes more than just some of the areas of identity. And as others present themselves, if this graphic needs to be changed again, we certainly can. And the best part about this new graphic is that it comes with both the Oxford English, in some ways colonized English standards of defining this term. And their definition says the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, gender, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage, a theoretical approach based on such a premise. And the term intersectionality was actually coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. So I wanted to go and find a space where Kimberly actually spoke to the term she created, and I found this quote that she delivered in 2019. I believe she did a Vox interview where she said intersectionality was a prism to bring to light dynamics within discrimination law that weren't being appreciated by the courts. In particular, courts seem to think that race discrimination was what happened to all Black people across gender, and sex discrimination was what happened to all women. And if that is your framework, of course, what happens to Black women and other women of color is going to be difficult to see. So people have often used the term intersectionality, and in most cases, they've used the term incorrectly. And the term does not just mean that you have a lot of different identities and that makes you unique and diverse. And though that in some cases is true, the reality is intersectionality refers to the compounding nature of identities, the way that they stack on top of each other to create voids in areas where oppression and discrimination thrive. So as you see this circle and you see all of these interlocking identities, I want you to think of intersectionality as the hole in the middle. Not the space around, but the hole in the middle, the space where the void exists, the space where discrimination, oppression, systemic racism, gendered identity, bias-based, living within binaries, all of those things exist within a compounding nature to a multiple identity struggle. So I wanted to make sure that for this discussion, we outline those things and frame them so that we can move forward with a full understanding that this is not just a conversation about race. This is not just a conversation about gender or orientation or ability. It is a conversation that weaves in between all of those things. So now that we are clear, I'm ready to move forward, and if I can click the slide, excuse me, and talk about today's discussion. So I found this quote as I was researching the topic of resistance in higher education specifically. And it is by scholar Dalia Rodriguez. And Dalia writes, having reflected on my pedagogical practices over the years, I remind myself that teaching social justice issues will always take place in an uncomfortable space. Risk required by anti-racist work should not guarantee a safe space, as this work is difficult in its own right. One of my major challenges in teaching majority students is the difficulty of getting them to understand their structural positions in society and to go beyond their own personal experiences. So with those things as a framework for how we enter this discussion today, I would now like to introduce you to our wonderful panelists. I will be reading their brief bios in alphabetical order. I always want to say that because I don't want people to think I like one more than the other. I love them all. They're amazing people. So we will begin today with Tiesha Douglas, who is a lecturer of business communication at Indiana University's Kelley School of Business, where she teaches strategic business writing and business presentations. Prior to her faculty role, Tiesha became the inaugural Associate Director of Diversity and Inclusion for Kelley's full-time MBA program, a role in which she served for over 2 years. Prior to Indiana University, Tiesha served as Eastern Kentucky University's Associate Director for Diverse Student Retention, where she created and oversaw the retention program for underrepresented minority students. The year 2020 marks Tiesha's 5th year of providing awareness and knowledge around diversity and inclusion issues and topics. Tiesha has 10 years of higher education experience, which includes fundraising and donor development and residence life. Tiesha obtained her bachelor's degree in business management and entrepreneurship from Western Kentucky University and her master's degree in public policy and administration from Mississippi State. Her experiences and upbringing inform her leadership style, in which she describes as the quote, "It takes a village." Tiesha is married to Dr. Torian Douglas, Associate Director of the Jellison Kelley Living Learning Center, and they have 2 sons, Taurus and Taj. Next, we have Rory G. James, who is the current Director of the Office of Student Diversity and Inclusion at the IU School of Public Health in Bloomington, a role he has held for the last 5 years. He earned a master's in public health and epidemiology from Tulane University and his bachelor's of science in biology from Tuskegee University. Rory has 14 years of experience as a higher education student affairs professional. Prior to arriving at IU, he served as the director of the Bruce D. Nesbitt African American Culture Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the director of the Intercultural Center at UNC Asheville. While in Illinois, Rory also served on the Illinois HIV Planning Group. His background encompasses undergraduate and graduate student engagement and professional staff development in cross-cultural competency. Rory has presented at dozens of local, regional, and national conferences on diversity and access, masculinity and outreach to Black and Latino men, sexual health education, student retention programs, and health awareness. And last but not least, Dr. Michelle Moyd is Ruth N. Hall's Associate Professor of History. She is also the Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society and the Associate Editor of the American Historical Review. She teaches courses in African history, the history of World War I, and the history of soldiers and veterans. So join me in welcoming our three wonderful panelists today. And as we begin, we're going to jump right in this thing so that we have time for your questions. Number one, what is social justice resistance and how does it appear in the classroom? We'll also start this off in alphabetical order. So we will start with Tiesha.
Great. Thank you so much for having me on. Hello, everyone. So I would like to start off first with the definition of social justice. So social justice is actually the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. It is justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. And so I share this definition because perhaps if we are able to explain what it actually is to our students, then the likelihood of their resistance towards it could decrease. So resistance could actually come in many forms, in different forms, and in which may not be easily identified. Instructors are likely to dismiss active resistance and perceive it as maybe ego or perfectionism, entitlement, or other internal explanations. But I found that resistance often stems from anxiety and fear. Examples of this could be repeatedly asking for clarification on an assignment that is clearly outlined in Canvas, refusing to participate during in-class discussions or not attending a diversity-related event that you're planning or have planned, providing surface level or lackluster answers to diversity-related questions, as well as complaining about the professor or staff member to other students, or even worse, to your own colleagues in the department, in which that case, of course, would likely get back to you. So, of course, these examples are more passive forms of resistance, but I think that it is what we see more of as our students are typically trying to protect themselves from getting through your class, getting the grade, versus actually engaging in a thought-provoking discussion about their discomfort with a social justice topic.
Thank you, Tiesha. We're going to kick that off next to Rory.
All right. Hello. Can everybody hear me? All right. Perfect. Thank you, first of all, to my colleague Tiesha for starting us with that definition of social justice, and particularly my context, definitely higher ed, but also my passion is public health. And I can come from this in many angles, my role as a practitioner and also the times I've taught in class. And when we talk about social justice issues, particularly in public health and healthcare, we are definitely acknowledging the social determinants of health. So the fact that there are inequities in health access, healthcare, providing typically based on either racism, segregation, transportation access, accessibility, health literacy. And so a lot of times our professors or instructors who are in public health use that context to talk about these inequities in health and what have you. Some things that I want to point out, because even with the word resistance, Tiesha did a great job of telling us how resistance can be passive, but also can be very forcible. And so I think about younger me when I first came out of my grad program and went straight into higher ed. I was called into a class. A white female professor contacted the Office of Multicultural Affairs and wanted to talk to my supervisor, the director, and me, and assistant director about coming to class, because in this class full of white students, they were blatantly using the N-word in class. And this was an English course. And so that has been over 10 years. I don't know whether they was reading a piece of literature that had that or if it was taught in context, but she could not manage the use of the slur. And of course, she was visibly bothered by this, and she wanted us to come in there and kind of manage the conversation. And so when we talk about social justice, I definitely want to put out that not only when we're talking about social justice, but just a blatant disregard for the feelings of people in the classroom, even if those people, the identities are not there. Just the resistance and using those slurs and derogatory language, that can be resistance. Then let's think about even body language. I think about some of the topics that when I do teach health equity, or if I'm talking about specific populations, observing your classroom. And so instructors, if y'all probably notice, and for whatever reasons, because we know what devices, cellular phones and tablets and laptops in a classroom, there could be a number of reasons, but when you present certain data or information and students may roll their eyes, or you see students check out as if this does not apply to me, this is not part of my identity, that is resistance. Let's call that out for what it really is. And so those are some things that we need to be mindful of. And tying in also to what Tiesha said, I would like to say indifference. Indifference is a form of social justice resistance. I think about when we're talking about topics of like environmental racism and what does environmental justice look like, okay? It is 2020. Flint still does not have, let's repeat that. Flint, Michigan still does not have quality water and access to water, okay? And so indifference can be just the fact that you can be in a class teaching about environmental justice or environmental health and think about your students who that's not a reality for them. They may have grown or were raised in affluent areas or just areas where they have access to water. And so since it's not part of their reality, yeah, I'm in this class to learn about that, but I'm not going to fully engage with it because I can't necessarily relate. And I'm not saying that's true for all students. We all come from various backgrounds, but I mean, indifference is a form of resistance, particularly if we're talking about equity and health or just social justice in general. Because we also know with that, disproportionately Black and brown people and people from lower socioeconomic statuses do live in these environments. And so getting the greater and larger community and population to care about these issues, okay? And then also when we think about resistance in classroom, I know, and Monica know this, we've been on several webinars. We always talk about microaggressions, which aren't quite micro, especially in 2020. But it's a term, and we're thankful for the researchers who did that in counseling psychology, what have you. I think about micro invalidations, even in the classroom, or micro insults. So those little, paper cuts, as we like to say, that add up. And so invalidating the experiences, a student may invalidate experience of their peer in the classroom who may be of varying ability status or of a different sexual identity or a different racial ethnic background. And so students pay attention to that, and those are form of resistance.